Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today we're going to be covering responding to some videos where some atheists try to take on some Presup, their understanding of Presup. So we're going to flip through, I think, 3 videos, and I will interact with them. And of course, I think one is, or 2 of them are call-in shows. Where someone asks about Presup, and then I think another one is a video just responding to, what does it say? It's a Presup's fatal flaw. So we'll talk about that one as well. So hopefully this is helpful. I'm not the kind of person that calls into shows like that, like the Atheist Experience or anything along those lines. I kind of don't like when someone has the capacity to boot or overtalk. I much rather enjoy either like a debate, a discussion, or face-to-face interactions. That's just me. There's nothing wrong with calling in to a radio show, but that's not my cup of tea. So what I'm going to do here is hopefully in my responses, it will help folks know how to navigate similar things that might come up in your interactions with unbelievers. So let's get started, and we'll take it from there. So our first video is called Counter Arguments to Presuppositional Apologetics. It's an episode of, what's the YouTube channel here? The YouTube channel is Truth Wanted. And a caller calls in asking about a counter argument that they thought of. And I guess they're asking the atheist host whether this is a good kind of argument to use when engaging with presuppositionalists. So let's start the video here, and we'll take it from there.
I want to get to Chris in Missouri, and Chris has a question that's come up on the show before, but I'm glad you guys are here to maybe kind of give your opinions on this. Chris is asking about counter arguments against presuppositionalism. How's it going, Chris?
Hello.
Hey.
Doing good.
Awesome. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about that.
So I have seen presuppositionalists on the atheist community shows, like Darth Dawkins, for example. And one of the things I've seen that at least I noticed a lot is there's a lot of different ways to counter the arguments. But I think there's a major flaw that I've been thinking about, that I've always wanted to talk to a presuppositionalist and see what they say, but I was just curious.
You called the wrong show. I don't think any of us are presuppositionalists. So
Yeah.
I'm just kidding, but
I just wanted to make sure that it's not necessarily, there's nothing, irrational about it or something like that.
Sure.
So, hey, I was really, but here, I'll just kind of go through it. But basically, from what it seems like, you use logic to set up your arguments when you're talking about something. That's your basis.
Yep.
And when they're using God as their basis, at least from my understanding, in order for them to even talk about that, they're also still assuming logic. So when they're saying that you can't know that logic is true unless God exists as that foundation, the argument they're making already assumes that logic is the case. And if they didn't do that, then they could have a God that could lie and not lie to you at the same time, and they couldn't tell the difference. No one could tell the difference. And I'm not sure that I've never really seen that kind of way to talk about that, but it seems like it's almost like it's a similar argument to the way they do it, because they say you're borrowing from that worldview. But in order to even understand their own worldview, they have to accept logic in the same way that everyone does.
Real quick before Stephen responds to this, we can hear a stream in the background. If you could just mute that for us, that would be awesome.
Yeah, here, I just got a different room.
Thanks. So it seemed that what you were driving at is the presuppositionalist must presume the laws of logic before they can have God. Is that correct on what you were trying to get across?
Yeah, and they use it. They use the God to get to logic.
Yeah, it's either one way or the other. So it can be that it depends on who you're talking to. You can pre-assume God, or you can pre-assume the laws of logic. And if you pre-assume the laws of logic and then you say there's a God, then you have to show it using that logic. So in that case, there's no issue. It just becomes a burden of proof that needs to be fulfilled like any other. Whereas if they assume a God, they need to say why they assumed a God before they assume the laws of logic. And that's where things get interesting. I think you'll find that it depends on who you speak with as to the way in which they approach it, and they'll approach it in slightly different ways. If you want tips on a very specific way, then it would be best for you to give us a little bit more of a feel for what you're looking for.
Yeah, what I appreciate about what is this guy's name? What is it? Is that Rationality Rules? I forgot all of these atheist YouTuber names. Yeah, what I appreciate about what he's saying there is it is true that there's a difference between presuppositionalism and, like, the method, and then there are people within that method that might argue in certain ways that are different. They're not necessarily the same. Everyone doesn't argue in the exact same way. So you need to acknowledge nuance within that perspective. So, sometimes I've been accused, of being a Clarkian presuppositionalist, which of course is not the case, and that is a big difference between when you're comparing someone who's a Clarkian presuppositionalist and someone who's a Van Tillian presuppositionalist. They're not the same. And actually, the difference and the nuance is of vital importance. It actually makes all the difference in the world in terms of understanding what a Clarkian is saying fundamentally and what a Van Tillian is saying fundamentally. So what I appreciate here by Rationality Rules is he is asking for more context because it really depends. So I appreciate that.
Okay. I was just kind of curious what your thoughts were. One other question that might be relevant is when dealing with, and I've seen this done on a live stream before, where you use street epistemology to talk to someone who's a presuppositionalist. I was wondering if
Introducing All Access, your premium gateway to deeper apologetic and theological insights. Through Q&A sessions, theological lectures, and exclusive bonus content, All Access takes your learning to the next level. Support the ministry of Apologia Studios while unlocking incredible resources like Ask Me Anything, which is an interactive live stream featuring Jeff Durbin. We have the Academy featuring theological lectures from leading experts and exclusive content from shows like Apologia Radio and Cultish. With more exciting content on the way, there's never been a better time to join. Visit apologiastudios.com and click join to get started today. So let me back up before he kind of asks another question here. So I wanted to let it go to give it context here. So his question is, when the presuppositionalist argues that you need God for logic, the presuppositionalist has to use logic or presuppose logic to even make the argument. So when we say something along the lines of that you either have to start with God or you have to start with logic, that's the question, right? And I think that's what he's bringing up. The idea is that if we try to argue for the existence of God, we have to presuppose the laws of logic. So we're not actually starting with God, we're starting with logic. Okay, this is a similar critique that was brought up by, if I can give some context to the caller's question, I would imagine the caller probably doesn't know this, but this was a common criticism brought up against the presuppositional approach by someone like R.C. Sproul. So R.C. Sproul accused the presuppositionalists, and I think fallaciously so, and I have an entire video just responding to R.C. Sproul if you're interested in that, on this same topic, is that the claim is that the presuppositionalist confuses ontology with epistemology, and this whole issue of proper starting points comes in. Is it the case that we start with God, or we start with ourselves, or in this case, we start with logic? Okay, and so it's either starting with God or starting with self, starting with God or starting with logic. And so if you say, I start with God, the idea is you don't really start with God because you have to use logic to even talk about God. So if you start with logic and not God, then you don't need God for logic because you're using logic and doing logic and reason and rationality, whatever, without God. You have to argue to God. Okay, that's the context. So the problem with that is that it's a false dichotomy, okay? And obviously so. There's actually a third option. So when you're given two options, when in fact there's a third option, that is called a false dichotomy. And so this is predicated upon the idea that the phrase to start with is being equivocated upon. Okay, you can start with something in different ways. For example, you have starting with in terms of chronology. Okay, you can chronologically start with something and then move on to something else, or you can start with something logically speaking. So we have logical starting with or logical priority, or we have chronological starting with. And so the assumption here is that when the presuppositionalist says that you need God in order to make sense out of logic, but then he has to use logic to argue about that. That is talking, the presuppositionalist is talking in terms of logical priority, not chronological priority. Dr. Greg Bahnsen brings this up clearly in his writings. He says, obviously, the presuppositionalist is not saying that we don't start with ourselves chronologically speaking in order to talk about God. That's obviously the case. What we're arguing is that in terms of logically starting with, okay, logical order, logical priority, not chronological order or chronological priority, we start with God logically speaking, God and his revelation, which provide the context, a meaningful context for understanding logic and justifying it in our worldview, okay? So yes, no one is arguing that we don't start with logic chronologically speaking, but we don't start with logic logically speaking in terms of the ultimate foundation. It is the triune God, the presuppositionalist will argue. It's the triune God who is the metaphysical basis that grounds logic, and his revelation, which is the epistemological link that links the all-knowing God, the all-powerful God. We're linked in terms of knowledge. God reveals things to us, and we could know truth about reality, not every single aspect of reality, but the things that God reveals, we can know it truly because God metaphysically grounds all things, and we are epistemologically linked to God's knowledge in as much as he reveals it to us. Okay, so here is the false dichotomy. You either start with God or you start with logic, or you start with God and you start with self. False dichotomy, the third option is that you start with both simultaneously. Okay, the Calvin brings this up. Knowledge of self is impossible without having simultaneous knowledge with God. God is the metaphysical context in which we can properly and adequately and meaningfully, intelligibly understand the self. God is the ultimate metaphysical context in which something like the laws of logic are grounded and rooted. Now, you don't have to agree with the presuppositional argument that maybe you think the argument isn't good or doesn't go through or doesn't account for the things that it claims to account for. But it's very important that you understand what we're saying, right? We're not saying you start with God and then move on to logic. We're saying that logically speaking, in terms of logical order, okay, knowledge of self is simultaneous with knowledge of God. The utilization of logic chronologically precedes God, but not logically. In terms of a worldview context, our metaphysical foundation is what couches and gives meaning to everything else that we do. All right? So we do not confuse or conflate ontology, the nature of being and our metaphysic, with epistemology, rather, we acknowledge their interconnected relationship. What I say epistemologically only makes sense within the context and backdrop of metaphysics. And everything that I say metaphysically is going to impact my theory of knowledge and how I know and all these sorts of things. And so you want to make a distinction between the different senses in which one can start with something. You can start with something chronologically. You can start with something logically. You can start with something in principle versus in practice. And so you need to understand that distinction. And that's the case even if you disagree with what the presuppositionalist is saying. I think it's just an important concept to be familiar with and understand its nuances, if that makes sense. All right, let's continue here. I think they brought up like street epistemology or something like that.
I was just wondering if anyone had any experience with how that might go, and just asking questions, trying to get down to how they come to that conclusion.
Well, I did talk to Darth Dawkins one time. He did call into the show. And Cy 10 Brugenkate talked about coming on. He never actually came on. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen that conversation, it didn't go anywhere. And I think it doesn't really, I mean, there's different kinds of people. I think there's people who kind of find these arguments for the first time and they kind of find them convincing, and maybe you can kind of talk about these things. And then there are people who have been doing this stuff for years, who've been kind of doing the same script and stuff, and it doesn't matter how many people they talk to, they're just going to want to keep talking about the same thing, right? Like, and that's fine. I think if you show someone who is like figuring this out for the first time, who hasn't got this ingrained in their head and is honest with how they approach this stuff, then you might be able to convince them. The real problem is I haven't found like one complete epistemology, one basis of truth and knowledge and yada yada that completely trumps like the kind of presuppositionalist mindset, because we can work with different assumptions and different kind of frameworks. I don't know of a framework that doesn't have any flaws.
Right. So the whole issue is epistemology and, of course, metaphysics, a worldview, right? We're arguing worldviews. Now, I like how he admitted this. I mean, it's like, I haven't found a perfect epistemology. Well, we are challenging as presuppositionalists the weaknesses of secular epistemology or non-Christian epistemology. Right? So admitting the weaknesses, that's what we're trying to get at. And we're arguing that the Christian epistemology, the Christian metaphysic, doesn't have the weaknesses that those other epistemologies have. Now, you might disagree with that, but remember, when we state our epistemology, you need to offer, because we're arguing worldview systems, an internal critique. And when that happens, it's often the case, at least in my experience, that folks don't quite understand what we're saying when we appeal to say something like revelational epistemology. And on top of that, if you are going to critique a perspective, it would help that you yourself have an epistemology that does not implode on itself. And the presuppositionalist is just simply trying to point out those flaws in the secular epistemology or the non-Christian epistemology, and trying to argue that the Christian epistemology, the revelational epistemology, just doesn't have those same problems, okay? And so that's where the discussion, the debate typically goes for people who are at least familiar with the importance of metaphysics, epistemology, and all these sorts of things in these kinds of discussions, all right? Now, I like how he's open about this. That's very, very helpful, okay? Now, he did make mention of people who argue dishonestly, and that's something, yes, you want to keep an eye out, but you want to be careful that sometimes I see that when the Christian does corner the atheist and he does sufficiently challenge their epistemology and they feel trapped, then oftentimes they turn around and say, oh, well, you're just being dishonest. This is some weird script that I can't respond to, and maybe I can't respond to it now, but there's something weird about it. No, just because you're stuck and trapped when you're being critiqued doesn't mean the other person is being dishonest. It might mean that a true weakness has been exposed in your perspective. Okay. And if you think that there is not a weakness in the perspective, then you have to argue those points. Okay. Same thing. When someone says the Christian epistemology is weak because, and they offer the critique. Okay. What I like to do is I like to evaluate, is the critique being offered toward me? Is it an internal critique? Is it acknowledging the fact that no one is neutral and that it's trying to jump into my worldview and show that given the presuppositions and aspects of my worldview, Christianity falls apart? If it's doing that, then I need to be able to respond to the attempted internal critique. Okay? But often the case is that the critique being offered against the Christian is an external critique. It does not hypothetically grant the Christian principle and try to judge it on its own terms. It tries to assert some kind of neutral point or autonomous point and then impose that upon the Christian position, say, see, it doesn't meet those requirements, and so here's a problem with the Christian worldview. And that doesn't work, right? When you're arguing worldview systems, philosophies of life, so to speak, paradigmatic issues, external critiques are not going to cut it. Okay, and what the Christian wants to do is want to hypothetically grant the skeptics or the secular or the non-Christian religious perspective, whatever it is, you want to hypothetically grant the truth of their perspective and then show that on its own terms it collapses. Now, some Christians do it better than others. Some Christians get frustrated and they don't say the appropriate things or whatever. But that's different than that's different than saying that there's a problem with presuppositionalism. Right? That's more of like how specific individuals argue. And so I agree with this host here that there are some presuppositionalists out there that don't argue in good faith. And to that, that's wrong. That's sinful. It's actually contrary to the very worldview that they're trying to defend. So yeah, I would say that, but that's irrelevant to the method itself, if that makes sense. All right, we'll let him finish up here.
I think no matter which one you kind of approach it to, there's always going to be limitations to it. So unless there's some philosopher out there that can prove to me otherwise, I
think, it's a great point. I think the best you can get when it comes to epistemology is, I think, therefore I am. And then, even then it gets...
And even then it gets kind of,
It gets a little bit thing, but...
Yeah, so that's the problem. That's the problem with skepticism, right? I mean, I've heard, someone like Matt Dillahunty. I think it was Matt Dillahunty. I apologize if I'm inaccurate there. I think it is. Where it's like he wasn't even certain of his own existence, right? You see, I think, therefore I am. He says, even that has problems. Well, I mean, if That's the problem, right? That's the problem with skepticism. If I've heard in my other, videos, and even Bonson brought this up in various contexts. I think in this book as well, it's brought up. Let me get this over here. Dr. Greg Bonson was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bonson U. Bonson U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bonson. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bonson U Plus and Bonson U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. Again, I've recommended this book multiple times. So if you're doing Presup, you want to get this book, okay? The Objective Proof for Christianity. And Dr. Bonson brings this, and this is the problem, brings this up. This is the problem with, the skeptical views, okay? If you start with yourself, with autonomy, then you will end with yourself. This is why the issue of solipsism comes up, right? How do you justify the reality of the external world? How do you get outside yourself? You see, a worldview that cuts itself off from the necessity of God and his revelation runs into those problems. The Christian worldview doesn't. Okay, we could account for why we know things that are genuinely and objectively true. We could account for why sense perception, for example, is generally reliable. Okay, those things are accounted for within the Christian worldview. And when you do not adopt that foundation, then you're going to run into these problems that they are admittedly saying that it's a difficult thing to answer. And that's because they are difficult on that basis. Okay. And this is not something that the Christian points out. I mean, this is borne out in the history of philosophy. Pardon. So yeah. Okay, let's continue here.
But the basic point is that you admit that you could be wrong on pretty much everything. Mm-hmm. And so when you speak with somebody and you say, what do you know for sure? Which is a good question to ask, talking about the street epistemology that you were mentioning. And then you can ask them why. But when they say they know for sure that God exists, mm-hmm. you know that you're having an issue here, because we know that humans cannot know anything for certain, basically.
So when you ask us, the Christian, if we Christian says, I'm certain that God exists, there's something wrong, because we know that it's impossible for human beings to be certain about anything. Of course, he's not even certain of that, and he's not even certain of that, and you get to infinite regress. That's a problem with the atheist worldview, pardon. That is the problem with the atheist worldview. That's not a problem with the Christian worldview, right? So there you go. If the Christian says, I'm certain of God's existence, or I'm certain of the truth of the Christian worldview, there's a problem, because we really know deep down that no one can be certain of anything. You see the problem? That's a tension there. That's a problem there, okay?
Maybe there's, I think, therefore I am. And then the whole...
But he's not certain of the maybe. I mean, it's just maybe, maybe not, right?
Conversation is going to be about that very small baseline. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it doesn't often go anywhere just illustrates how important it is at that baseline.
And I don't see people talking about this point in particular, but like the idea of God itself is a socio-cultural thing mm-hmm. that like came up in history, at least from what we study it, right? Like we can show a time before people thought of mm-hmm. the Hebrew God and the Judeo-Christian God essentially, and people who come to it now. So like we at least have evidence that this was an idea that people came up with. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we could say the same if we're talking about assuming that everybody knows God. And like if you really believe that everybody in their heart knows Jehovah specifically and like Yahweh and not any other, like I think you're missing out on the entirety of human history, and you're completely ignoring.
But maybe we're not, right? On your own basis. I'm not playing a script here, but like on your own basis, you're not even certain of that. You're not even most probably certain. Like if you appeal to probability, even probabilities presuppose certain certainties. But if we can't be certain of anything, then it really is a crapshoot. For all you know, the Christian perspective is correct, and the word of God is true when God, in the Christian worldview, who knows all things, created man in his image, know the nature of the fact that unbelievers suppress the truth and unrighteousness. That could be true on your view, okay? And if you say, well, it's unlikely because look at all these people when we say, do you know God? And they say no. It's like, well, I mean, if the Christian worldview is true, God is exposing the heart of individuals. And so you can't say on your perspective that is very likely not the case or vice versa because, again, you're not going to be certain of anything. There's no reason to to be convinced of a perspective that has no certainty in any area, even in the certainty of the results of certain probabilistic considerations, right? So that's a fundamental problem within the secular perspective. That's not a fundamental problem within the Christian perspective. Okay, you can reject the Christian perspective, but your rejection is going to be rooted in a worldview in which there is absolutely nothing we can be certain about, right?
Just everybody who's ever said anything to the contrary, and like it's hard to work with that. It's like, okay, if you're not going to listen to these people, I'm sure you're not going to listen to me. So
And when you do talk to presuppositionalists, I think it does actually have to require some form of street epistemology, because you need to get down to how they've justified their worldview. And so those are the conversations you're going to have.
So street epistemology is, I say this respectfully, but I think it's like a poor man's version of presuppositionalism. But I wouldn't even call it that. I mean, it uses a similar approach to presuppositionalism, but when presuppositionalism uses kind of like a Socratic approach where we're asking questions and getting to the foundation, it's not primarily used as a tactic to get someone to. The reason why we ask, like, for example, how do you know, is because it gets to the root of someone's justification. Like, what is your justification? Okay. And it's, it's meant to kind of get at that fundamental worldview level. Now, of course, the atheists can do this as well. It's useful. If I were talking to a street epistemologist, that would be useful to me because it will allow me to kind of bypass some of that surface level discussion of like, well, nobody's neutral and, we interpret the evidence differently and then we go back and forth on that. If we can just simply at the start admit, I have a starting point, you have a starting point, I have presuppositions, you have presuppositions, then there's where the argument really is going to be had at that kind of worldview level. Then at that point, we're engaging in worldview analysis, worldview comparison, internal critiques, and things like this. So a street epistemology, at least from how it's typically used by many atheists, is to kind of use a Socratic approach in asking questions to get to the fundamental justification that the person has for holding to, their deep convictions in the case of Christians, like why they believe Christianity is true. And it's typically used to create doubt, right? So that people haven't really typically ever thought at that deeper level. And so they're kind of like, well, how do I know that? And then, of course, the atheist can take multiple tactics at that point. By the way, there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. Right? Someone asks questions. The presuppositionalist is not the only person who's allowed to ask, how do you know? Okay. When we ask, how do you know, we're asking really for your epistemology without using the word epistemology. Okay. And when the unbeliever asks, how do we know? Then we should tell them our epistemology. Okay. Now, depending on who you're talking to, you might not say it in fancy philosophical terms, but yeah, you want to be able to explain from the Christian perspective how knowledge is gained. And so we can lay that out. All right. Let's skip here. There's like only a few minutes left. I'm not sure if they get into anything of note after that. Let's see here. Okay. In this second video, this is entitled Why Waste Time with Presups, and I guess this is a call-in show. One of the hosts, the atheist host, is a man by the name of Eric Murphy, I think, an individual that I debated / had a discussion with some years back. If you guys are interested in that interaction, it is entitled A Friendly Dialogue with an Atheist. I think that's what it's called, A Friendly Dialogue with an Atheist. I'll try to have the link to that video in the description of this video, so you can take a look. And it is what it is. It is a friendly dialogue with an atheist. Eric Murphy, I had a great conversation with him. We were able to get into some stuff. Issues of presuppositionalism and transcendental argumentation comes up and things like that. External versus internal worldview critiques. All of that comes up in the discussion, so I highly recommend folks check that out. That was, back when I was in my rookie days when I barely ever did stuff like that. And I don't have time typically to do it a lot here now in the present day, but that was a lot of fun. It was a great discussion. Highly recommend folks check that out. But that's the individual with the black curly hair you're about to see. That's Eric Murphy, and he has his co-host there with him as well. And so they're taking questions relating to Presup. So let's play that.
I know that you want to take North, and I do want to talk to North, but first I would like to talk with Tom in Georgia, because Tom's been waiting on the line for a while.
This whole time, actually.
Yeah. So, Tom, you wanted to talk to us about talking to Presup callers.
That's
is that
right.
correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah. What are your thoughts?
So, last week, good old Robin called in, and I've called to talk about precepts in general with you guys a few months ago. And I was looking forward to it. I was like, oh, great, maybe because you guys have probably made the most progress with precepts and peeling back the layers of what they exactly believe and getting them to, cop to it. But it was just more of the same last week. So I was talking to people on like the Facebook and chat stuff, and it seems like precepts have kind of run their course with you. So I was wondering if you are, thinking about entertaining them in the future. And if so, I had like some argument ideas that might be helpful.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for thinking that we've made progress, because it doesn't feel like that sometimes, but I appreciate that.
Well, the big bombshell was when you got him to say he was a Platonist, and that opened up this whole other world. Like, oh, you believe there is an apple that speaks for all apples. Like, that's a whole other thing.
Oh, yeah, because the thing is, a lot of precepts, and I'm not going to say all of them, but a lot of them don't really dive into additional forms of philosophy or talk about things outside of that particular argument. So they know the script really well, and they might even be able to justify that rationally in their own heads. But when you get them into the realm of, well, are you a Platonist? They might say yes, because they don't fucking know what that is.
All right, yeah, so that's a great point, that there are people who try to engage in presuppositional apologetics and transcendental argumentation, and that's kind of their only focus. So it's very weird and awkward for them to kind of engage in issues that pertain to philosophy that are outside the direct domain of that kind of argumentation. Again, that's not a feature of presuppositionalism. That is a feature of particular individuals. I mean, you take someone like Cornelius Van Til. I mean, the guy was very, very well versed in the history of philosophy. As a matter of fact, some of his students complained that every time he would answer a question, he'd walk you through the history of philosophy to answer the question, up until the point that by the time he gets to your question, you're like, I don't remember what I asked, So presuppositionalists traditionally have been very philosophically educated and kind of know the history and flow of thought. Greg Bonton as well, he comes from the more analytic philosophical tradition, definitely familiar with Plato and Aristotle. I mean, you have critiques of Plato and Aristotle and other Greek philosophers in the works of Dr. Bonson. But it is true, and I think it's very helpful that when Christians interact with atheists, you want to be familiar with kind of a general overview of philosophy. Obviously, it's not necessary. Philosophy, in terms of knowing certain schools of thought, whether it's Platonic philosophy or Aristotelian philosophy or, more modern, like Kantian or Cartesian sort of rationalism, all that kind of stuff, they don't always come up in discussion, but it is good to be familiar with kind of the basic outlines of the history of thought, because I would agree with this host here that a lot of Christians will engage in these discussions and not really be familiar with kind of the terminology and schools of thought. All right. Just to lay it out real quick, I mean, I'm a Van Tillian presuppositionalist. I'm not a Platonist. I do not believe in a realm of ideals, the forms that exist out there independent of a mind or anything along those lines. But again, I can say that and explain it because I know what Platonism is. If you don't, you need to, pick up a book on the history of philosophy and educate yourself. I think that's very important, and I think it's a good point the host brings up here. And I appreciate that the host makes nuance between certain presuppositionalists and like some of the ones you might find like online interactions and things like that. So I appreciate that.
So it feels to me like one of the reasons that I have hesitations around talking to precepts is because once we try and get out of that particular script and dive into the philosophical implications of that script, it kind of falls apart because that's not where they're prepared to go.
Well, that's not where some people are prepared to go. The philosophical implications, that's something we should be willing to go because that's where all the juicy stuff is, right? What justifies our claim to say that the Christian worldview is true and provides the necessary preconditions for logic, for knowledge, intelligible experience, so on and so forth. So it is true. Some people are not equipped to kind of get into those philosophical, what is inferred from the things that we are saying. Now, I lost my train of thought here. Let me just rewind it just a little bit, a couple of seconds back so I can get what she said.
Philosophical implications of that script, it kind of falls apart.
Yeah, so it's a mention of a script. So a lot of people make mention of the script, like the Presup script. I'm not sure what people mean by that. Maybe it's referring to like the presuppositionalist has this thing they want to go through, like this like line of reason they're trying to get across, and they kind of talk about that specifically. This always confused me. We're not talking randomly, right? Isn't it the case that everyone has quote unquote a script? Like when I get into a conversation with someone, there's somewhere I want to lead the conversation to, right? I have a destination. Okay. There are reasons why I ask specific questions, and I anticipate a kind of a certain range of answers that I might possibly get. And then depending on the answer, I want to move somewhere else as well. I mean, is that what it means to have a script? I mean, in that case, I don't see why you wouldn't want a script. I mean, surely when they talk to atheists, when they talk to Christians, there's a script. There are certain things that they are anticipating, and they're trying to get a certain point across. I don't think that that's inherently wrong. Now, can you use a script to be deceptive? Sure, that can be the case. But again, that's different between again, I keep saying this, there's a difference between presuppositionalism as a methodology and presuppositionalist in terms of how specific individuals use that methodology. But let's see what they say here.
And it's useful to highlight that, but it also can get very repetitive if the entire conversation is, you're on a script, let's get off the script and talk about like what you're actually wanting to talk about and like what the implications for that would be. And they say, no, we're going to stay on the script. Like,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or when someone says, well, I want to stay on the script, sometimes the things that the atheist or skeptic brings up is in fact irrelevant to the main point that we're getting at. In case you want to be careful. Now, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're bringing up something that is relevant and important, and you want to be able to address it. But sometimes, and in my case, many times, things that are brought up are moving away from the core aspect of what we're trying to argue. And so you want to make a distinction between a genuine bringing up of a legitimate issue and a red herring, where someone is bringing up something that is going to derail the conversation and debate from what needs to be discussed. So you're going to need to have some kind of level of, nuance in terms of how to navigate when those issues come up in discussion. Okay. And don't just say, that's a red herring. Explain why you think it's irrelevant. Okay. So if you're going to accuse the unbeliever of committing a fallacy, you want to be able to explain why that's the case and allow them to respond as well. Okay. But they do often, I mean, anybody can do this, right? Christians do this too. We can often bring up issues that really aren't related, even though we might think, well, this is so important, when in fact it's not actually addressing the key issue. And so that's going to just take a little bit of experience in having those conversations to be able to navigate when those things come up.
It's ultimately, I think that there are a couple of things that are bound up in this conversation, and I would love to take this opportunity to address a few of them. One of them, we've gotten a lot of comments saying, you're never going to convince the caller, so why are you wasting your time? Stop, you're not convincing the caller. We don't have expectations that we're going to be convincing callers. When somebody calls in, right. I don't look at the, at the call log and go, I have a really good chance of convincing caller 3. And so we're going to talk to caller 3.
Right. That's a great point that Eric makes, is that there is a difference between like proving your point and like persuading someone. So there is a distinction between proof and persuasion, which is what the presuppositionalist says all the time, right? When I engage with people, I'm not automatically, convinced that I'm going to convince this person in this specific instance, right? But that doesn't mean I haven't proven my point. Okay, so you want to keep those two things distinct. Proof and persuasion are not the same thing. Presuppositionalists say that, and apparently non-presuppositionalists acknowledge that as well. That's an important point to keep in mind.
Because that's not useful. And if you're going to change your mind on a dime like that, that's not healthy. And so if, for people who are watching that are saying, oh, well, you're arguing with this Presup and you're never going to convince them. Well, no, duh. We're having this conversation because a lot of people don't get to see them had out and don't get to see, what happens. And that's a really interesting conversation to see had out. Especially for a lot of people who the only people they know are family members, crazy Uncle Joe, who is, really, really going down this one rabbit hole. If you don't want to damage your family dynamic, but you still want to see how that conversation's had, that's what we want this channel to be useful for. So first off is that for people who are saying, well, you're never going to convince them. Well, no, duh, that's not what the show's about.
I mean, it's a bonus. Like, we try, but
it is. But if somebody says, I was watching and you positively influenced the way that I look at the world and I have a more critical eye because of what you've done on the show. Awesome.
Right. And vice versa for the Christian too, right? I can prove my point. That doesn't mean I'm going to persuade someone. But in the discussion, if I were to show some of the merits of my position, which has happened before, right? That's a win, right? Ultimately, we rely on the sovereignty of God, right? God uses our words, right? God uses means to accomplish his ends. But I don't go into every discussion thinking everyone that I'm going to speak to is going to be convinced, right? But there is fruit in the discussion. It's part of the process, so to speak. And there's still benefit to have those discussions. Now, of course, there's not a benefit. I mean, well, I suppose there can be benefits to, the derailed discussions. I suppose you can find good reasons to have those, but not intentionally. Of course, you don't want to intentionally get into discussions which are getting nowhere, right? There's value to give your response, even though the person's not convinced at all, especially for people watching and things like that. But you also want to choose the context in which you engage wisely. Okay. People who are like intentionally argumentative, it just becomes like you're just trying to shout over the other person. At that point, I think you need to kind of move on. People ask me this all the time, Eli, when's the best time to move on in a discussion? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't have like a rule like, well, when the atheist says this is when you end it. It just really depends. It takes experience in having conversations with people. We need to learn to kind of keep our cool. I mean, I resonate a lot with what they're saying in terms of maybe not these individuals, but some people bring up that it can be very difficult talking to presuppositionalists. And the difficulty is not necessarily in reference to the argument they're giving. Sometimes that's the case. Some people will admit, yeah, they're making this interesting argument. I'm not sure how to respond to it. I need a little time to think about it. But sometimes the difficulty is in the character of the person, that the aggressiveness of the argument is coupled with the aggressiveness of the character, and the person can come across as just really, really annoying, obnoxious. And at that point, if you claim to be Christian, you need to kind of put yourself in check. And really evaluate whether you're doing what you're doing for the honor of Christ, or are you doing it for your own pride? Okay, so in that sense, I kind of resonate. It can be difficult to talk to some people when they're doing that.
Awesome. Number two, there's a big difference between a select group of presups and all presups.
Yeah.
Not all presups are going to say, I'm offended that you aren't following my script. Not all presups are going to be pushy and bossy and rude.
Evidence of that is my discussion with Eric. If you listen to our discussion, it was like literally the title, A Friendly Dialogue. Like it literally was that. It was a great dialogue. We were able to talk about a lot of stuff, and it was very useful. So I appreciate that distinction.
In fact,
well, in that case, let me limit it. I'm sorry. Let me just limit it then to the Darth Dawkins flying monkeys, because the question then is, are those conversations useful? And I used to be of the opinion that let them talk and kind of expose this, point of view that they have. But now I think it's just going nowhere. And I think you're at a disadvantage because you're trying to argue honestly. And the best example I saw of turning the conversation on, turning the script on its head was I saw a YouTube clip where a guy said, look, let's just assume that I'm completely wrong about everything, right? My worldview is based in absurdity, and I don't have a rational thought in my head. Now, tell me about Jesus and supernatural revelation or whatever it is that it's...
Right. If you admit that the presuppositional is right, what is not entailed by that, or what is not inherent to the presuppositionalist perspective, is that suppose your view is wrong. We don't say you don't have a rational thought in your head, right? That's not the position, right? So it's not the Christian presuppositional position that the unbeliever doesn't know anything, right? That's a caricature of the position. But if you were to grant the presuppositionalist perspective is true, and you say, well, just tell me about Jesus, then the presuppositionalists, or just the Christian in general, should be willing to do that. You want to be very careful too. Sometimes we're so focused on like kind of the apologetic aspect of the interaction that we don't recognize a good transition to kind of like, well, at this point, if this person just wants to hear about Jesus, like, let me tell them about my Lord. Let me tell them about Jesus Christ and how salvation can be had by placing our trust in him, so on and so forth. And at that point, you're not necessarily having to give or continue the argument that you did. Now, the argument that you presented as to why it's true, right? When someone says, well, okay, so then why should I believe that? Then you're offering a justification. So that's different, right? But you want to be able to kind of understand that nuance and shift in discussion. When someone says, okay, I understand. Let's say I'm wrong. Tell me about Jesus. Okay. That's a great transition. I think you should be willing to go into it.
Has convinced you, and keep it on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that you called in, Tom, because we had this conversation literally last night. And I was talking about how we cannot argue honestly with somebody like that, and that an argument that is meant to flummox and not to communicate.
So false. So an argument that is meant to flummox and not communicate. Now, again, you need to make a distinction between individuals and the actual method and argumentation. Okay, what is the centerpiece argument for the Christian, for the presuppositionalist? It is the transcendental argument. Now, if you look at the history of transcendental arguments, the purpose of transcendental arguments are not to flummox and confuse someone. Okay, someone might present it in that way and couch it in that kind of language, but that is not the argument, right? The argument follows the basic structure of any transcendental argument. Obviously, the unbeliever is not going to accept what we fill in as Christians, what we fill in the X and the Y, right? The X is the necessary precondition for Y therefore X or whatever. You're obviously going to dispute what we put in those letters, so to speak. But the argument itself is not for the purpose of confusion, right? You don't want to conflate the argument versus like how people argue for it.
Is going to be a better tactic moving forward. I agree with you.
Because their thing isn't to, argue honestly. It's to prove that atheism is wrong. So if you start out with, yeah, you know what? Atheism is wrong. Now tell me about Jesus.
So I've seen a bunch of different approaches that could be really beneficial. It just depends on whether or not we want that conversation with that specific group of people, or if other presups want to call in.
Right. We're not going to take that track with other people just because they're a presup. In fact, a lot of Christians, just in general, tend to have presuppositionalist beliefs without even knowing that that's what they're called. So this is definitely something that is reserved for those that we know are being dishonest, because we have actual freaking video evidence of it, right?
Right. So there you go. They are following a principle, which I would agree with, that you want to choose your conversation partner wisely. If you think someone's being dishonest and being manipulative, then don't engage if you think that that's what they're doing. And if you find someone who's like, hey, I'm willing to actually kind of have this discussion or have this debate, and then, you choose wisely and you have that discussion. The same thing, right? They recognize it. We should recognize it as well. And I think that's a good rule to follow. Okay, we're kind of running down. There's only a few more minutes here. Let's move on to our last segment here. This next video is called Presup's Fatal Flaw. Presup's Fatal Flaw. So let's take a look at what is Presup's fatal flaw? Let's see.
Have you ever had a strong desire to bang your head against a wall? Do you love talking to people who love to try and dominate others in conversation? Well, have I got some news for you. These desires can be met, and more. All you have to do is try to engage a presuppositionalist on the internet. To be fair, not all presups are as obnoxious as some of the knuckle-dragging examples online.
Oh, thank you. There we go. I've been saying this all for years, right? Not everyone's the same. Okay, there's a difference between the person using certain argumentation and the methodology, so forth itself. There's a clear distinction there. So I appreciate that.
Online might lead you to believe. It's possible to find a few cordial ones, and those who actually participate in academia are often much more nuanced and generally seem to be likable people. James and Anderson of RTS is one example. But this, unfortunately, is not true of many others. Philosopher Alex Malpass explains, the best representatives of the presuppositional apologetic are trying to elicit a Copernican shift in the way that the worldview is argued for.
That is a correct evaluation. If I understand him correctly, Dr. Malpass is correct here. The best representatives of the presuppositional apologetic are trying to elicit a Copernican shift in the way that the worldview is argued. Yes, Van Til's presuppositionalism has often been referred to as a Copernican revolution in the realm of philosophy and apologetics. Okay, so I would agree with Dr. Malpass there.
The worst representatives are not trying to do this. What they are up to is trying to confuse the non-Christian instead of addressing the actual arguments against Christianity. Any confusion on the part of the interlocutor is then pounced on as evidence that the argument has been won by the Christian. There is conceit behind such tactics.
Now, yeah. So, I mean, it depends what you're trying to say. He says, okay, so let's read this here. So, what they are up to, and this is the worst representatives, they're up to trying to confuse the non-Christian. Well, I guess there are some people who could engage in that, right? Instead of addressing actual arguments. Yeah, for a presuppositionalist, you should not avoid objections. You shouldn't avoid them. Now, you should address the presuppositions that underlie them, because oftentimes the objections are predicated upon presuppositions that need to be challenged, but we should not avoid them, right? If you are simply avoiding objections, then you're not engaging in apologetics from a biblical perspective. I mean, the Bible doesn't teach us to avoid objections. I mean, 1 Peter 3:15 says to always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's in you if anyone should ask. So if someone asks, what's the reason for the hope in you? Well, what about? You need to be able to engage those whatabouts. Of course, not doing so without addressing the presuppositions can be a problem, okay? But I think sometimes the unbeliever will interpret our addressing the presuppositions behind their objection as avoiding the specific objection in question, and that's not true. That's not true at all, okay? When someone says, there's no evidence for, the Christian worldview, and I say, well, what do you mean by evidence? Oh, well, you know what I mean by evidence. No, well, evidence is interpreted in light of worldviews. Oh, there you go with your script. I mean, that's, you need to kind of stand your ground. It's like, well, wait a minute. We do have different worldviews, and our worldviews and presuppositions impact the way we interpret these things. So since we're debating worldviews here, I'm not simply going to assume the categories of neutrality that you bring to the table and kind of engage you at that level, because our difference is really more fundamental than that. In that sense, it's not meant to avoid, it's meant to clarify, and that we're not acquiescing to the unbeliever's presumptive, this presumption of neutrality, okay? Now, if people are doing this to avoid objections, then yes, I would agree that would be the worst. You'd be in that category of the worst representatives if you're simply trying to evade, which we shouldn't be doing. It says any confusion on the part of the interlocutor is then pounced on of evidence that the argument has been won. Yeah, I guess, I'd have to see a specific example of what he's talking about there.
Behind such tactics. Consider this example by well-known presuppositionalist blockhead Cy ten Bruggencate. Before we go any further, let's be clear about definitions. When we use terms like reason or reasoning, what are we talking about? In philosophy, reason refers to a faculty or ability in virtue of which one makes appropriate doxastic judgments that have a high likelihood of approximating to truth. It's important to keep this definition in mind as we return to the topic at hand. There are only two options for someone when asked Cy's question. Either fall into the trap by trying to use their reason to demonstrate that their use of reason is valid, circular, or admit that they can't do it. Once this happens,
Right, so let's get back to, you can't hear it if you're listening to the podcast. There was a reference to Cy. Let me see here. Let me see if I could find that. There we go. All right. Okay, so what's coming up on the screen here is, I guess, a tweet by Cy ten Bruggencate says, without using your reasoning, can you demonstrate that your reasoning is valid? Yeah, people don't like that question, but I think it's a perfectly valid question, right? And in other words, there is, if you answer yes, then obviously there's a problem. If you answer no, there's a problem. Okay. And basically what Cy is trying to point out, and I don't want to speak for Cy himself, but at the fundamental paradigmatic level, then yes, there is a certain level of circularity. Now, I would make a distinction between vicious circularity and virtuous circularity, a distinction not made up by presuppositionalists, by the way. But I would make that distinction. I just think that people don't like this question because they don't know how to answer it in a way that gets them out of the challenge. That's my opinion. Okay. And so, yeah, I don't think there's a problem with the question at all. And you're going to see, well, let's see how they address it here and why this is so. Why do they find a problem with this? I guess he's challenging them at a fundamental level. People don't like to be challenged at a fundamental level, and so when you challenge them and press them at those pressure points, they'll accuse you of, well, you're not really debating, or that's not real philosophy, or whatever the case may be. But I think that's a perfectly valid question to ask.
Presup generally begins to act like they have a way out of this problem, and they will
start describing the attributes of their God and how rational he is and how logic is part of his divine nature, and he created a rational world, and that we're made in his image with an innate capacity for logic, and we're designed with reliable cognitive capacities.
But here's the
So when you ask the Presup this, what they do is they provide a metaphysical, ontological, and epistemological explanation as to how God does, in fact, and the Christian worldview does, in fact, provide the foundations for logic. Yes, that's what we do. Yes, that's true. That's what we're supposed to do. By the way, it's not a simple a just so story. We're arguing that story must be the case because it does, in fact, provide those preconditions for the very things that we take for granted. You see, the unbeliever's job is to disagree and give their justification, which they often do not want to do. Okay? So yes, given the ontological status of God being all-encompassing, okay, he is the immaterial grounding of logic. He has revealed himself. He is the foundation for knowledge. His ontological status as an universal, all-encompassing being and ground of all reality and creator and definer of all derivational facts. Yeah, that's a justification. How does that justification, how is that, I guess, that picture that the Christian paints, how is that justified? Well, transcendentally. Reject it, and you're in the same pool, so to speak, of the unbeliever, which let's see how they respond to this.
Here's the rub. When they give you this just so story, notice that
They invoke their God as the guarantor of the reliability of their cognitive capacities and inferential procedures or magically zapped knowledge. When they do that, just point out politely and without rudely interrupting that they have, in the very act of explaining all of this to you, used and relied upon their own cognitive capacities and inferential procedures in the very act of demonstrating their...
Whoa, the old ontological epistemology confusion, right? Presuppositionalists confuse ontology with epistemology. That's obviously not the case. We addressed this before, okay? So again, this is kind of old hat kind of stuff. I mean, if you're familiar, R.C. Sproul brings this up, and we've responded to it a billion times. It's not a hard objection, although it can be difficult if you're not familiar with the interplay between ontology and epistemology. But it is not a difficult question. I'm not going to rehearse the answer here as I addressed it before, but surprise, surprise, right?
Demonstrating their conclusion. And thus they've argued in a circle. The moment they...
there's a difference between reasoning in a circle and arguing in a circle. There's no argument from a presuppositional perspective in which the conclusion is baked into one of the premises. Okay, no one is arguing in a circular fashion in that sense. Okay, two things: the the transcendental argument, as formulated by Cornelius Van Til and explicated by Greg Bahnsen, they argue that it is an indirect argument. Transcendental argument is an indirect argument. Now, indirect arguments are not typically laid out in kind of like a premise conclusion. That's what you call direct argumentation. So if the transcendental argument is traditionally formulated as an indirect argument, then how can it be guilty of something that is a feature of a direct argument? Okay. Now, let's suppose we do lay out the transcendental argument in a direct fashion. Then at that point, it's not fallaciously circular because no direct transcendental argument, when it's formulated in that way, has the conclusion baked into one of the premises. Okay, it just isn't. That's just not the nature of the argument form. So again, this is all assuming things and mixing categories that really have no warrant.
The moment they set out using any reasoning, rely upon their memory, present premises, posit or presuppose anything, they're engaged in reasoning. They will be, in that moment, assuming the very reliability they're supposed to demonstrate in their conclusion.
Yeah, that's right. We assume the reliability of the I to correct the I. That's right. Well, if it's a presupposition, though, then you can't justify it. Well, again, there are many things that are presupposed and also evidenced and justified, like the laws of logic. Right? If I'm going to demonstrate to you the reliability and validity of logic, I have to presuppose logic to do it. So I presuppose it, and we argue that logic is valid and necessary by the impossibility of the contrary. If you reject it, you have to assume it in order to rationally reject it.
In their conclusion, and so will have failed to satisfy their own challenge, which they put before you. Don't fall for the naive intuition that we all have, that there must exist some way of defending reason that doesn't itself assume the reliability of reason.
Oh, that'd be naive. Yeah, it is naive. let's let him finish here. I don't want to interrupt you.
Reason. Don't fall for the naive intuition that we all have, that there must exist some way of defending reason that doesn't itself assume the reliability of reason. There is no such argument that isn't itself circular. The presuppositionalist can't do it either.
No, we do it transcendentally, right? How do we justify our ultimate presupposition? All right, he's just assuming that presuppositions cannot be justified. When someone says that, challenge that assumption. Okay, a transcendental argument, is trying to do just that. It's trying to provide a justification for ultimate preconditions. Okay, someone says it's impossible to justify a presupposition. That's just to implicitly reject the possibility of transcendental argumentation. Ask them, what is your justification for denying the possibility of transcendental argumentation? Okay, you don't just get to assert that, right? So, again, all of this is based upon a misunderstanding of the nature of transcendental argumentation. I mean, this isn't difficult. I mean, it just takes a little bit of knowledge in terms of what transcendental arguments are trying to do and what they are, right? When someone says, the presup argument is meant to confuse, it's like, well, if we're using a transcendental argument, that's not the purpose of a transcendental argument, right? You can't demonstrate presuppositions. Actually, you can transcendentally. Maybe you don't agree that the Christian has done that successfully, but that's irrespective of the idea that we're trying to justify a presupposition. Okay, we're justifying a presupposition through argumentation. Disagree with the argument and validly critique the argument. But to say that we can't even do transcendental arguments, which is the implicit implication of what he's saying, itself needs to be justified. And he's admitting that at a fundamental level, there is a certain level of circularity. But again, there's a difference between circular reasoning at the fundamental level and circular argument when you lay out premise, and conclusion. There's a difference between a presupposition of an argument and the premise within an argument. When I give a transcendental argument for the existence of God, I don't not presuppose the existence of God. That would be self-refuting for my own position. Because if I'm arguing that God is the necessary precondition for intelligibility, and I have to presuppose that in order to even meaningfully and intelligibly give an argument. But in my presupposition, I don't lay that out in the premise. There's nothing in the argument itself in which the conclusion is also stated in the premise. That's just not the case. And that is if the argument is presented in a direct fashion. Okay? If it's offered in an indirect fashion, then obviously the assertion that we're engaging in circular argumentation doesn't fly. So whether it's indirect, it doesn't fly. And if it's a direct, it doesn't fly either. So there you go.
No one can do it. We're all in the same epistemological boat.
And how does he know we're all in the same epistemological boat? Oh, I'm sorry. Presuppositionalists are not allowed to ask the how do you know question because that would be our script. Yeah, right. When you ask how do you know, don't be annoying and keep repeating it over and over and over and over again. But don't be bullied into thinking that by asking the question, you're not doing real philosophy. How do you know is a fundamental epistemological question. If you don't know how to answer it, then perhaps you need to be careful with the kinds of assertions that you make. Same thing with the Christian. The Christian says, God exists, the Bible's true. How do you know? How do you justify that? We need to be able to have a justification. What is our justification? Well, the transcendental argument. Well, I don't agree with the transcendental argument. Great. So now you're going to respond to the transcendental argument and our attempted justification with a counterpoint, right? And of course, it's at that particular point where the unbeliever is not going to want to show their hand. Now, some who do want to show their hand and say, here are my presuppositions, here is how I make sense out of that, then we need to meaningfully interact with what they say, which is what we want to do. It's what we should do. But often the case, we never get that far, unfortunately.
Put another way, they've fallen into the very trap they've laid for others, using their reason to give you reasons that their use of reason is valid. How, you might be wondering, could some people make such a crucial oversight? Well, it turns out that when people are more interested in using rhetorical tricks to beat others into submission, they tend to make bumbling errors.
So is it a rhetorical trick to ask someone to justify their ultimate foundations? That's a rhetorical trick. So what is not a rhetorical trick is just to grant them their ultimate foundations, which is the very thing they're going to use to try to argue against our position. So grant them that, right? You're basically granting them a small island of neutrality and autonomy so that they can get up and then argue against your position, right? That's not a rhetorical trick. That is actually asking someone to justify their worldview. We're not simply asking you to justify reason. We're asking you to justify reason within the context of your professed worldview. Okay, it's another thing. Oftentimes people will kind of focus on like reason or logic. Remember, when we're debating and discussing the difference between Christianity and like atheism or skepticism or agnosticism or Islam or whatever, we're engaging in an analysis of philosophical systems. We're not simply arguing over one specific thing. We're arguing with the skeptic, for example, how do you justify your reason given your worldview? Okay, your metaphysic, your epistemology, your ethic, your entire system of thought. Okay, it's not a trap. It's asking you to justify your view. If you don't like to be asked those kinds of questions, like that's fine, but then don't engage in debate. Don't engage in the discussion unless you're willing to actually provide a justification, right? And that's I mean, this isn't hard, right? I mean, the Christian is going to give his justification. The non-Christian is going to disagree. And then you don't just get to disagree. You need to then just demonstrate why the thing that the Christian has put forth as the explanation, the justification, okay, why it's wrong. And then the Christian in turn needs to then interact with those criticisms. That's how debate happens. But there you go. All right, let's let it finish. It's only a couple seconds left here.
Who knew? Oh, and by the way, here's an entire playlist of me responding to apologists.
So there you have it. We covered a bunch of things there. Hopefully this is helpful for folks. Remember, and I just want to end with this, never be afraid to ask, how do you know? But as a Christian, you need to be willing to answer the question when it's turned around on you. When it's asked in good faith, then, interact and provide the justification that the Christian worldview provides us with, okay? And of course, you want to choose your interlocutors wisely, right? So there you go. All right. Well, I hope this is helpful. If you like these kinds of videos and you want me to respond to more things, click the like button, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and maybe put some links either in the comment section, or you can email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com a video you would like me to respond to. And so I want to try to do a little bit more of these. I think this is useful for folks. Hopefully, I hope it's useful for folks. And you can send me a link to a video. Just make sure it's manageable. I mean, the videos I responded to, there's like a clip here and clip there. If you kind of, dude, I want you to respond to this thing, and it's like 2 hours long, obviously, I'm not going to be able to do that. But if you have a clip or something that you want me to interact with, you can email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com. Guys, thank you so much for listening in with me. I hope this was useful to you guys. Until next time, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.